The sirens tore through the night like a scream that wouldn't end. Red and blue lights painted the marble lobby of Vale Enterprises as uniformed officers stormed through the revolving doors. Julia stood frozen beside the reception desk, her hands trembling as two policemen snapped cold metal around her wrists. Cameras flashed from the upper floors where curious employees filmed her humiliation. And above them all, from his glass penthouse, Adrian Vale watched. Silently, his expression unreadable, almost rehearsed. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak, but the words refused to leave her throat. The officers recited her rights in monotone voices that sounded mechanical, indifferent. Julia's mind blurred, fragments of numbers, meetings, and Adrian's smile spinning together into disbelief. "There's been a mistake," she whispered, but no one listened. The smell of disinfectant and fear filled her lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a phone kept ringing, unanswered. The flash of a camera caught the tear sliding down her cheek. To everyone watching, she was the traitor, the thief who had stolen millions. Adrian stepped closer to the glass railing above, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp as razors. He didn't look angry, he looked relieved. That tiny detail struck her harder than the accusation itself. The lobby, once her daily path to ambition, had become her stage of ruin. The elevator doors closed around her like prison gates, sealing her fate. The reflection of her cuffed hands shimmered against the steel walls. Delicate fingers that once typed Adrian's secrets, now marked with shame. Outside, reporters shouted questions. "Why'd you do it, Julia? Did he know?" Her silence became her only defense. For the first time, she truly understood what powerlessness felt like. "Before I tell you what led to this moment, pause for a second. If you were in Julia's place, accused, humiliated, betrayed, would you still believe in justice? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you think the truth always finds a way, no matter how deep it's buried. Now, let's rewind the story. Let's see how a loyal secretary became a criminal in the eyes of the world. It began 6 months earlier when Julia first walked into Vale Enterprises, a world of glass walls, expensive silence, and dreams disguised as opportunity. She had just landed the job everyone wanted, executive assistant to Adrian Vale, a self-made billionaire with a reputation for brilliance and mystery. That morning, Thesky lines shimmered outside his office like liquid gold. Julia believed she was stepping into her future. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. Adrian was everything people said: charming, confident, magnetic. His voice carried authority that could silence a room, yet there was a sadness in his eyes that made people want to save him. He treated Julia with rare kindness, thanking her personally after every late night. Over time, admiration blurred into trust. She started to believe in him, not just as a boss, but as a man who saw her potential. The work was relentless but thrilling. Meetings with investors, international calls at midnight, private jets waiting on standby. Adrian often said, "In business, loyalty is everything." Julia took those words as gospel. She never questioned the spreadsheets he asked her to approve, nor the quiet transactions he said were strategic. Each click of her mouse was another invisible thread tying her to his empire. Then came the first small crack, a missing document, a discrepancy in the accounts. Julia mentioned it once, nervously, and Adrian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Leave it to me," he said softly, too softly. After that, he started locking his office door more often, taking calls in whispers. Still, Julia convinced herself it was normal. After all, billionaires had their secrets, but secrets have a way of growing teeth. Late one night, as the city slept and the building lights glowed faintly against the fog, Julia saw something she couldn't unsee. A series of transactions sent from her login, though she hadn't been at work. Her pulse quickened. Someone had used her name, her computer, her trust. The digital fingerprints of betrayal had already been planted. When Julia first stepped into Adrian Vale's office, it felt like walking into a dream, sculpted from glass and sunlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a living painting, and everything, from the polished mahogany desk to the faint aroma of cedar and coffee, spoke of precision and power. Adrian looked up from a folder and smiled, the kind of smile that made people feel seen. "You must be Julia," he said. "Welcome to the heart of the machine." His voice was calm, measured, dangerous in its charm. She spent her first week learning the rhythm of his empire, the morning briefings, the afternoon calls with investors, the late nights filled with quiet urgency. Adrian's commands were efficient, but never cruel. He praised her attention to detail, her composure, the way she anticipated needs before he voiced them. Soon she became indispensable, the pulse of his schedule, the keeper of his secrets. Staff whispered that no one had ever lasted this long so close to him. Adrian was more than a boss. He was an enigma wrapped in elegance. He read obscure philosophy during lunch breaks and quoted poets during meetings. Sometimes, when the office was empty, Julia would find him staring out the window as if searching for something beyond the city lights. "Success," he once murmured, "is just another kind of loneliness." Julia laughed nervously, unsure if it was a confession or a warning. Over time, the distance between them began to blur. She learned the exact way he liked his coffee, how he preferred silence over apologies, and when his temper was about to surface. Once, after a disastrous meeting, he thanked her for staying late and offered her a glass of wine. "You make chaos look manageable," he said. It was the first time she saw the exhaustion behind his perfection. That night, as they worked under the hum of fluorescent lights, Julia felt something shift. Adrian spoke about his ex-wife, a story wrapped in betrayal and bitterness. "People pretend to care," he said, his eyes cold, "but in the end, they take what they can and leave." Julia didn't know it then, but he was already rehearsing his own defense. In the reflection of the window, their faces looked like strangers, sharing a secret they didn't yet understand. Weeks turned into months, and Julia's life became orbit around Adrian's world. Birthdays were missed, friends drifted away, and her mother's calls went unanswered. The job consumed her completely, but every time she thought about leaving, he would say something that pulled her back. A compliment, a small gesture of trust. She told herself she was seen, valued, perhaps even protected. That illusion was worth the sacrifice. One evening, during a storm that rattled the glass walls, Adrian called her into his office. "Julia, I need you to authorize a few transactions while I'm away," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Routine transfers. Nothing to worry about." The rain pounded harder as she signed the papers without reading them. His eyes lingered on her signature, satisfied. Outside, thunder roared like an omen. The next day, she found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a handwritten note. "Loyalty never goes unnoticed." No name, no explanation, just Adrian's. Precise handwriting and a faint trace of his cologne. Julia felt her heart swell with pride and unease. It was a gift and a warning, wrapped in the same breath. She kept the note in her drawer, unaware it would one day become evidence. As the weeks went on, subtle changes began to creep into Adrian's demeanor. He grew sharper, distracted, always on the phone. The warmth in his tone cooled into calculation. When Julia asked if something was wrong, he smiled, the same smile that first welcomed her, and said, "Everything's fine. Trust me." But that phrase, "trust me," suddenly felt heavy, like a door quietly locking behind her. Outside his office, the city glittered with the illusion of progress. Inside, the first fractures had already begun to form, invisible, silent, deadly. Julia couldn't see them yet, But soon they would swallow everything she believed in. And when they did, it wouldn't be her world that shattered, it would be his. The morning began like any other. Polished shoes echoing against marble floors, screens glowing with numbers that never seemed to rest. Yet something in the air felt heavier, like static before a storm. Julia noticed it first, in the way people whispered near the elevators, glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. The office, once a symphony of productivity, now pulsed with unease. Something was wrong, but no one dared say it aloud. That afternoon, while delivering reports, Julia paused outside Adrian's office. His voice, usually smooth as silk, was sharp and urgent. "I said move the funds quietly. No trace." Then silence. She froze, unsure if she'd misheard. When he opened the door moments later, his expression was calm again, composed. "Everything all right, Julia?" he asked. She nodded, forcing a smile, but her pulse betrayed her. Rumors began to spread, whispers of disappearing money, of clients suddenly cutting ties. The finance department seemed to hold its breath. During lunch, a nervous accountant muttered something about offshore accounts before falling silent when Julia walked by. Her stomach knotted. For the first time, she questioned the foundation she'd built her loyalty upon. Maybe trust was just another illusion, like glass pretending to be strength. Late one night, after everyone had gone home, Julia stayed behind to finish paperwork. The city lights flickered below, casting reflections across the empty office. Out of habit, she checked the company's internal transfer logs. That's when she saw it. A series of transactions under her login, approved at hours she'd been nowhere near her desk. The numbers blurred before her eyes. Her name was there, but her conscience was not. Her hands trembled as she printed the record, each page feeling like a heartbeat of dread. "It must be a mistake," she whispered, though the words tasted hollow. Adrian's office door was closed, the faint light underneath flickering like a secret. She thought about knocking, about demanding an explanation, but something inside her warned against it. She left quietly, carrying the papers like they might explode. The next morning, Adrian greeted her with his usual charm. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. Julia hesitated, then mentioned the strange transactions. His expression didn't change. "Leave that to accounting," he said, waving it off with a practiced smile. "You've been working too hard." But his tone, too smooth, too fast, felt rehearsed. The words slid like oil across water. From that day on, the office no longer felt like a workplace. Adrian's meetings grew more private. Doors closed faster, whispers lasted longer. Julia caught glimpses of new faces, men in suits she didn't recognize, leaving his office with guarded eyes. When she tried to ask questions, the HR director gently reminded her to focus on her duties. It was the kind of politeness that hides fear. One night, as she left the building, a gust of wind sent her papers flying across the plaza. As she bent to gather them, one page caught her eye. A copy of an internal memo with her name and the words "Transaction Authorization Confirmed." But she'd never signed that document. Her throat tightened. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried her downfall within it. At home, Julia couldn't sleep. Every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified by paranoia. She replayed Adrian's smile in her mind, now sharp, sinister. How long had he been planning this? Or worse, was she imagining it all? The walls of her apartment seemed to close in as if conspiring with her thoughts. The next morning, she decided she'd confront him, not as his assistant, but as the woman being buried by his silence. She rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd demand the truth. But when she arrived, his office was empty, the chair spinning slightly as if he'd just left. On his desk lay a single folder with her name on it. And inside, the first piece of evidence that would destroy her life. The folder on Adrian's desk was perfectly centered, as if placed there for her to find. Julia hesitated before touching it. Inside, she saw printed bank statements, transaction logs, and digital signatures, hers. The dates matched the mysterious entries she'd discovered. Every page screamed guilt. Her stomach twisted as she flipped through the papers. It wasn't just a setup, it was a masterpiece of deception. Adrian entered moments later, his expression unreadable. "You're early," he said casually, walking past her to pour a glass of water. Julia's voice trembled. "What is this?" she asked, holding up the folder. He looked at her as though she were a stranger. "Evidence," he replied softly, "and I'm sorry you saw it before we could talk." His tone was calm, too calm, the way predators move before they strike. Her world tilted. "You think I did this?" she whispered. Adrian sighed, rubbing his temples as if burdened by her incompetence rather than her pain. "I don't know what to think, Julia," he said, "but millions are missing. Someone has to answer for it." The words struck like a slap. The man who once trusted her now looked at her as the problem to be solved. That afternoon, 2 corporate auditors arrived. Their briefcases gleamed, their smiles were thin. Julia watched as they connected a drive to her computer, scrolling through her files like surgeons inspecting an open wound. One of them murmured, "All transactions approved under her credentials." The other nodded. Adrian stood behind them, silent, arms crossed. His presence felt like judgment itself. By the end of the day, she was escorted out of the building under the guise of temporary suspension. Her co-workers avoided her gaze, whispering behind screens. The once friendly receptionist could barely meet her eyes. Julia clutched her purse like it could shield her from the humiliation. The revolving doors hissed, shut behind her, and with that sound, her life inside the tower ended. That night, she sat in her dark apartment surrounded by papers, trying to piece together the puzzle. Every login, every timestamp, every email, all pointed to her. She searched for any clue of tampering, but whoever did this was meticulous. Her reflection in the laptop screen looked foreign, pale, desperate, hunted. She realized she was fighting a ghost made of data and power. The next morning, a knock shattered the silence. When she opened the door, 2 police officers stood there. "Julia Evans?" one asked. She nodded, heart pounding. "You're under arrest for corporate embezzlement and fraud." The words hung in the air like poison. Her body went cold as one officer read her rights. The other tightened the cuffs. "There's been a mistake," she cried, but they didn't slow down. At the station, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bleaching the color from her world. They took her fingerprints, photographed her face, and locked her in a cell that smelled of rust and bleach. Across the room, a detective flipped through her case file, the Vale Enterprises logo stamped on every page. Julia tried to explain, but her words drowned beneath the sound of his pen scratching against paper. Hours later, Adrian arrived, not as her ally, but as the company's representative. He didn't look at her directly. "I hope you understand this isn't personal," he said. His voice rehearsed for the cameras. "The evidence is clear." Julia felt something inside her fracture. "You set me up," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, leaving the scent of his cologne lingering like guilt. As the cell door clanged shut behind her, Julia sank to the floor. The echo of metal felt final. Outside, reporters shouted her name, their flashes cutting through the bars like lightning. Her career, her reputation, her freedom, all gone in a single, calculated move. And somewhere far above the chaos, Adrian Vale raised a glass of champagne to his reflection. The courtroom smelled of old wood and polished fear. Julia sat at the defendant's table, her wrists marked from the handcuffs they'd just removed. The air was thick with whispers, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing, strangers deciding her fate with their eyes. Across the room, Adrian Vale sat among his lawyers, immaculately dressed, unshaken. He didn't look at her once. The man who had trusted her with his empire now treated her like a shadow. Her court-appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously, avoiding her gaze. "We'll do what we can," he murmured, though his tone already carried defeat. Julia's throat tightened as the prosecutor rose, laying out graphs, numbers, and documents that painted her as a cunning thief. Every detail had been arranged perfectly, every email, every signature, every transaction. The story was airtight. She wasn't on trial for what she'd done, but for what Adrian wanted the world to believe. When the first witness took the stand, a company accountant, Julia barely recognized him. His testimony was rehearsed. She had full access. She was the only one who could have moved those funds. The words cut deeper than any blade. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat echoing, "Liar, liar, liar." She tried to object, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, whispering, "Stay calm." But calm was impossible when the truth was being strangled. During recess, Julia caught a glimpse of herself in a hallway mirror. Her reflection looked older, smaller. Behind her, Adrian walked past, flanked by cameras and bodyguards. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His gaze was void of remorse, but filled with something worse, fear. In that split moment, she realized it. He wasn't watching her lose. He was watching to make sure she didn't speak. Back in court, the prosecution revealed new evidence, a recorded phone call allegedly confirming her involvement. Julia listened in horror to her own voice, stitched together from previous recordings, manipulated to sound like confession. She turned to her lawyer, who only shook his head, powerless. "Your Honor," she cried, "that's not real." But the judge's gavel silenced her words. Truth had no place here, only narrative. As testimony after testimony buried her deeper, Julia's resolve began to fracture. She stared at the floor, tuning out the voices that condemned her. The courtroom became a blur of sound, murmurs, pens, footsteps, until all she could hear was the faint ticking of the clock. Time was moving, but not for her. Somewhere in the back row she thought she saw a familiar face watching her, maybe Marcus from IT, but when she blinked, he was gone. When Adrian finally took the stand, Julia's pulse stopped. His voice was calm, rehearsed, dripping with sincerity. "She was brilliant," he said softly, "but lately she'd been distant. I thought it was stress. I never imagined she was capable of this." The courtroom leaned in. Julia could barely breathe. His lies were art, painted with empathy, framed with false regret. Every word felt like another nail in her coffin. By the time the defense spoke, no one was listening. Her lawyer mumbled through closing arguments while the prosecutor smiled. The judge's expression was carved in stone. When the verdict was read, the words came slow, deliberate, merciless. "Guilty on all counts." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Julia's eyes flooded with disbelief. The sound of the gavel struck like thunder in her chest. The bailiff stepped forward, clasping her wrists once more. As the cold metal bit into her skin, Julia turned to Adrian. For a moment, their eyes met again, and she saw it, the flicker of guilt behind his mask. It was brief, almost human, before he looked away. He stood to shake hands with the prosecutor as she was led past the reporters. The cameras captured his victory. No one noticed her broken silence. Outside, the rain poured against the courthouse steps as she was pushed into the waiting van. Through the barred window, Julia stared at the blurred city lights, each drop of rain a reflection of everything she'd lost. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this wasn't the end, that the truth, like water, always finds a crack. and when it did, it would drown him. The first night in prison felt endless. The air was thick with bleach and despair, and every sound echoed. Footsteps, whispers, the clanging of metal doors. Julia sat on the narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling as the reality sank in. She had traded skyscrapers for concrete walls, silk for steel. Outside, the world kept turning, but hers had stopped. Her cellmate, a woman named Ruth, watched her with cautious curiosity. Ruth was older, her eyes sharp from years behind bars. "First time?" she asked, her voice gravelly. Julia nodded, too numb to speak. "Then listen close," Ruth said. "In here, you keep your head down and your heart locked." The advice hung in the air like smoke. Julia realized survival here required a different kind of strength, the quiet kind. Days bled into weeks. The routine became mechanical. Roll call, breakfast, labor, silence. Julia spent hours folding uniforms in the laundry room, the scent of detergent and sweat clinging to her skin. At night, she replayed every moment with Adrian, searching for signs she'd missed, cracks in his perfect mask. Each memory was a wound she couldn't stop touching. Guilt wasn't her burden, disbelief was. Ruth became her anchor in the chaos. She taught Julia when to speak, when to disappear, and how to read danger before it reached her. One evening, as they sat under the dim glow of a flickering light, Ruth said, "Everyone in here's innocent. At least that's what they tell themselves. The trick is to remember who you were before they told you who you are." Julia stayed quiet, but those words carved themselves into her heart. Letters from the outside stopped coming. Her mother's number was disconnected. Friends vanished. Even the media had moved on. Julia had become what society does best, yesterday's story. Yet deep inside, a stubborn ember of defiance refused to die. When guards mocked her or whispered, "The billionaire's thief," she met their eyes with calm silence. Shame couldn't touch her anymore. Sometimes at night she'd dream of the city, the hum of traffic, the scent of rain on glass, Adrian's office glowing in the skyline. In those dreams, she was still his assistant, still trusted, still free. Then she'd wake to the hum of fluorescent lights and the metallic taste of grief. Freedom had once been her cage. Now the cage had become her test. One day, while working in the laundry, Julia overheard two guards talking. "They're going through Vale's old data servers," one said, "cleaning up the mess." The words pierced her like a current. "Why now?" the other asked. "Legal stuff. Some IT guy flagged encrypted files." Julia froze mid-fold. For the first time in months, hope, fragile and dangerous, flickered within her. That night she couldn't sleep. She stared through the small window above her bed, where a sliver of moonlight painted the wall silver. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. The thought that someone out there might still find the truth set her pulse racing. Ruth noticed and murmured, "Careful with hope, kid. It's the sharpest blade in here." Julia smiled faintly. "Maybe that's exactly what I need." In the days that followed, Julia felt a shift inside her. She began to walk taller, to meet each day not as punishment, but as preparation. She no longer dreamed of escaping. She dreamed of proving them wrong. The whispers of injustice had turned into a promise, one she intended to keep. Somewhere out there, a thread of truth waited to be pulled. As the night fell once more, Julia pressed her palm against the cold wall, imagining the skyline beyond it. "You can hide behind glass, Adrian," she whispered to the darkness, "but even glass breaks." A single tear traced down her cheek, not of sorrow, but resolve. And far away in a server room filled with humming machines, a forgotten email waited to change everything. The hum of machines was the only sound in the server room, a mechanical heartbeat beneath Vale Enterprises' flawless surface. Marcus Reed, a junior technician with too much curiosity for his own good, stared at the screen before him. His shift was supposed to end hours ago, but a routine data migration had stalled. Lines of code crawled across the monitor like secrets trying to hide. Then something strange caught his eye. A directory that didn't belong. It was buried deep, far below standard access levels, hidden beneath layers of encryption. Marcus frowned, tapping commands with cautious precision. "That's odd," he muttered. The folder's metadata showed it hadn't been touched in since before Julia Evans' arrest. A chill ran through him. The label read simply, "Backup Archives Restricted." No one in IT ever dared touch restricted, but curiosity is a dangerous form of courage. He bypassed the first firewall, then the second. Each click felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. The deeper he went, the more he realized this wasn't a normal backup. It was an intentional burial. Files were mislabeled, timestamps altered, and logs rewritten. But hidden among the clutter was one document that refused to disappear. Transfer logs. Final. EML. His heart quickened. EML. An email. Marcus opened it. The screen flooded with text, numbers, and two names, Adrian Vale and Julia Evans. His stomach dropped as he read the thread. Adrian instructing another executive to reroute funds through Julia's account to reduce risk visibility. The email was time-stamped days before the supposed theft. The proof was right there, glowing in blue and black. Marcus leaned back, whispering, "Oh my God!" He knew what this meant. He also knew what it would cost him. Adrian Vale wasn't just a boss. He was a force. People who crossed him didn't get fired. They vanished. Marcus glanced at the surveillance camera blinking in the corner of the room. He minimized the file, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat. He had just uncovered a weapon, one that could destroy a billionaire. For a long moment he did nothing. The air seemed heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. He considered deleting what he'd found, pretending it never existed. But then he remembered Julia's face, not from the headlines, but from the security badge photo he'd archived months ago. She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like someone who still believed in fairness. That memory anchored him. He copied the file onto a flash drive and slipped it into his pocket. The small piece of plastic felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every step toward the exit echoed like a countdown. Outside the server room, the building was dark and empty. The silence of wealth pressed against the walls. The kind of silence that hid screams very well. Marcus didn't look back. Driving home, his thoughts spiraled. He could take this to the authorities. But who would listen? Adrian Vale had friends in every high place. Judges who owed him favors, journalists who protected his image. Marcus imagined the knock on his door, the quiet threat disguised as a conversation. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Fear had teeth, but truth had claws. That night, he couldn't sleep. The flash drive sat on his desk, glowing faintly under the computer light, like it had a pulse of its own. Every time he tried to look away, it pulled him back, a reminder that silence was complicity. Outside his window, rain fell in soft, rhythmic waves, washing the city clean. Marcus wondered if the truth could do the same. By morning, his decision was made. He would find a way to get the evidence to someone who could use it, quietly, carefully, anonymously. He didn't care if the world forgot his name, as long as it remembered hers. He picked up the flash drive, slipped it into a plain envelope and whispered, "For her." Somewhere inside that tiny device, justice was waiting to be heard. Marcus stared at the printed copy of the email spread across his kitchen table, the paper trembling in his hands. The words were precise, calculated, the language of power disguised as procedure. Authorized transfers via Evans' access to maintain plausible deniability, Adrian had written. The phrase plausible deniability repeated in Marcus's mind like a curse. Every line confirmed it. Julia hadn't stolen anything. She had been used, a pawn in a billionaire's game of self-preservation. He turned on his laptop and compared the timestamps to public reports of the supposed theft. They aligned perfectly. Adrian's orders came 2 days before Julia was arrested. Her downfall had been scripted before she even knew she was a suspect. Marcus leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, his pulse echoing in his ears. He felt both righteous and terrified. He had proof, but proof meant nothing if no one dared to believe it. He snapped photos of the email with his phone, encrypting copies in multiple drives. He'd seen enough thrillers to know that people like Adrian didn't lose quietly. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick with reflection. Streetlights glimmered on the wet asphalt like nervous stars. Marcus closed the blinds, locking the door, his movements quick and deliberate. Paranoia wasn't irrational anymore. It was survival. In the quiet of his apartment, he reread the thread, line by line. The second message hit hardest. Ensure Evan's digital footprint remains traceable. She'll take the fall if things go wrong. Marcus exhaled sharply, his throat tight. He imagined Julia in her cell, staring at grey walls, unaware that freedom sat in a folder someone had tried to erase. Rage and pity collided inside him. He destroyed her, Marcus whispered, and smiled doing it. The hum of his computer fan filled the silence, steady and relentless. He clicked through the remaining attachments, transaction receipts, internal memos, and a trail of forged authorizations, all tied to Julia's login. Each document was another blade, each signature a scar carved into her name. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Adrian Vale hadn't made a mistake. He'd crafted a masterpiece of betrayal. Suddenly Marcus's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He froze. For a long moment, he just stared at the screen until the ringing stopped. A voicemail icon appeared, but he didn't play it. His reflection in the dark monitor looked pale, anxious. He knew Adrian had the resources to find out who accessed those archives. Maybe he already knew. Maybe Marcus had just signed his own sentence. He turned off the phone and powered down the laptop, heart hammering. For a moment, the silence felt suffocating. He could almost hear Adrian's voice in his head, calm, condescending. You don't understand the cost of truth. But Marcus did. He understood too well. The truth didn't just cost, it consumed. Still, something in him refused to let this story die in the dark. He pulled out a small notebook, scribbling names, dates, and file paths. If something happened to him, someone had to know where to look. Then he sealed one of the printed copies in a plain envelope and wrote on it, "To the public defender of Julia Evans." His handwriting shook, but his resolve didn't. He would find a way to get it to her team, no matter the risk. Before dawn, Marcus walked to a 24-hour post office, hood pulled up, hands trembling in the cold air. The clerk barely glanced at him as he slid the envelope into the drop slot. It was done. The moment it left his hands, he felt both lighter and exposed, like the truth had taken a piece of him with it. Somewhere in that envelope lay redemption, not his, but hers. As he stepped into the pale morning light, Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. The city was waking, unaware that justice had just been mailed in silence. He took one last look at the skyline and whispered, "It's your move now, Adrian." But deep down, he knew. Moves like this never went unnoticed. Marcus hadn't slept since mailing the envelope. Every creak of his apartment made him flinch. The blinds stayed shut, the lights dim. On the news, Vale Enterprises continued to shine. A new merger, a philanthropic donation, Adrian. Vale's smile flashing across the screen like a mask made of gold. Marcus muttered under his breath, "You think you're untouchable." He wondered how long it would take before Adrian realized someone had touched his secret. 3 days later, he received confirmation from the postal tracker. The envelope had been delivered. The relief lasted only seconds before paranoia took over. What if the lawyer ignored it? What if Adrian intercepted it? He began watching his phone like it was a live grenade. Each ring, each vibration made his stomach twist. Silence was supposed to be safety, but now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. At Vale Enterprises, whispers began to circulate. Someone had accessed old backups. Adrian's personal assistant mentioned seeing him pacing his office, face pale, jaw clenched. He ordered a full systems audit and demanded to know who'd been working the night of the migration. Marcus's name came up instantly. Within hours, his access was revoked. His email account vanished. It had begun. He tried to stay calm, telling himself he'd expected this. Still, when two men in dark suits appeared outside his apartment that evening, his heart nearly stopped. They didn't knock. They just stood there, watching. Marcus turned off the lights and crouched by the window, barely breathing. After a few minutes they left, but he knew they'd be back. Adrian didn't threaten. He erased. Desperate, Marcus found an old burner phone and composed an anonymous message to Julia's public defender. Check company archives, February 12th. Look in hidden email logs. Truth is there. He hit send and deleted everything. His hands shook uncontrollably. He'd crossed the line between witness and target. Outside, thunder rumbled. Not weather, but warning. That night he packed a bag. Laptop, flash drives, the remaining copies of the email. He left his apartment through the back alley, blending into the city's sleepless hum. Neon lights reflected off puddles as he walked, head down, every stranger a potential spy. For the first time, he understood what Julia must have felt, being hunted by shadows too powerful to name. He checked into a cheap motel on the city's edge, the kind where no one asked questions. The wallpaper peeled, the air smelled of mildew, but it was safety, temporary, fragile, real. From the flickering TV, he heard a familiar voice. Adrian, giving an interview about corporate transparency and moral responsibility. Marcus laughed bitterly. You're talking about ethics now? His laughter cracked into silence. Days blurred together. He survived on cheap food and adrenaline, his eyes red from scanning online news. Nothing. No mention of Julia, no investigation, no hint that anyone cared. The envelope had disappeared into the void. Marcus began to wonder if truth really mattered in a world run by men like Adrian. But then, one morning he saw it. A small headline buried in a legal blog. Convicted assistant files for appeal. He read the article 3 times, heart racing. Julia's lawyer had requested a motion to review new evidence. It didn't mention the source, but Marcus knew. The message had reached her. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. A tired, fragile smile that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He whispered, "She knows now. She knows." Still, the danger was far from over. He could feel Adrian's shadow closing in, the silent machinery of power grinding behind the scenes. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was moving, alive, unstoppable. Marcus looked out the motel window as dawn painted the sky in bruised pink and gold. "Run all you want, Vale," he murmured. "You can't bury what's already been dug up." And somewhere in a prison cell, Julia would soon feel the first spark of hope. The morning began like any other. Grey light bleeding through the barred window, footsteps echoing in the corridor, the metallic clang of doors opening and closing. Julia had stopped counting the days. Time inside moved differently, slower, crueler, circular. She sat on her bunk, folding and unfolding a worn piece of paper, the last letter she'd received from her mother months ago. "Keep your faith," it said. But faith felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. During mail call, her name was read aloud. "Evans, Julia!" The guard tossed an envelope through the bars. She frowned. No one wrote anymore. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, neat but hurried. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line and one date. Truth never deletes itself. February 12th. Her heart stopped. She didn't understand how, but she knew this wasn't random. She stared at the words, tracing them with her fingertips. The ink had smudged slightly, as if written in haste. February 12th. That date. It echoed somewhere in her memory. A meeting, a transaction, something about the day Adrian's voice had trembled during a call. The meaning was foggy, but the message was clear. Someone out there was still fighting for her. Someone hadn't forgotten. Ruth noticed the change immediately. "You got news?" she asked, watching Julia's eyes light up for the first time in months. Julia hesitated, then nodded. She whispered, Maybe everything isn't lost." Ruth smirked. "Careful with hope, kid. It burns fast." Julia smiled faintly, then let it burn. The cell felt different that night, less like a tomb, more like a cocoon. Unable to sleep, Julia pressed the letter to her chest. For the first time in months, her heartbeat felt steady. Truth never deletes itself. The phrase looped through her mind until it became a prayer. She imagined the servers of Vale Enterprises. Humming in the dark, machines holding secrets the world had forgotten. Somewhere in that digital silence, her redemption waited. The next day, she wrote to her lawyer. The guards mocked her for being hopeful again, but she didn't care. Her letter was firm, demanding, "File an appeal. Something was missed. Search for company backups." February 12th. It wasn't a plea this time. It was a command, a flicker of her old self, the confident, capable woman Adrian had once admired began to re-emerge through the cracks of despair. Weeks passed before she got a response. The lawyer's letter was brief but electric. "We found something. You were right to ask." Julia read it over and over until the paper tore at the folds. Ruth watched silently, then nodded. "Told you, sometimes the truth just takes the long way home." Julia laughed softly, tears of relief and disbelief mingling on her cheeks. For the first time, the cell didn't feel cold. Outside, the world was beginning to whisper again. A blog had picked up the story of a convicted secretary seeking justice through digital evidence. Julia's name returned to the news, but this time, not as a criminal, but as a question mark. Who really stole the money? The narrative was changing, and she could feel it, even behind concrete walls. The system that had silenced her was beginning to stutter. One night, as she lay awake listening to the rain against the bars, she whispered, "Into the darkness, whoever you are, thank you." Somewhere in another part of the city, Marcus looked out his motel window at that same rain, unaware that his message had found its way to her heart. Two strangers, connected by truth, breathing hope into a story built on lies. Julia folded the letter carefully and hid it inside her pillowcase. The guards could take her freedom, her reputation, her time, but not this, not her spark. She closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in forever. "You can't delete the truth," she whispered. And far away in his glass tower, Adrian Vale woke from a nightmare, sensing, for the first time, that something was coming for him. Adrian Vale's morning began with silence, the kind that precedes a storm. The skyline outside his penthouse glowed a sickly orange as the sun rose behind polluted clouds. His phone buzzed non-stop. Legal advisors, board members, journalists. He ignored them all. That email, had resurfaced. He didn't know how, but the very message he'd buried in digital ash had crawled back into daylight. For the first time in years, fear tasted real. He stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the glass walls rattled. "Who accessed the archives?" he barked. His assistant flinched. "It traced it to a technician, Marcus Reed," she stammered. Adrian's pulse quickened. "Reed, that kid?" He stared out the window, jaw clenched. Below, the city looked smaller, like something he could crush in his palm. Yet he felt it, control slipping through his fingers like sand. He called his head of security. "Find him," Adrian ordered. "I don't care how, just fix this." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Fix it how, sir?" Adrian's tone turned to ice. "You know how." As the line went dead, he exhaled slowly, forcing his composure back into place. Power, he reminded himself, was all about illusion. As long as you act unafraid, the world believes you. But inside, cracks were forming. At the morning board meeting, whispers followed him like smoke. The CFO avoided eye contact. 2 directors exchanged looks when he entered. "There's chatter online," one said carefully. "Something about a recovered email." Adrian smiled thinly. "Baseless rumors," he said, but his hands twitched under the table. Every lie felt heavier now, like holding his breath underwater, waiting for the oxygen of denial to run out. After the meeting, he locked himself in his private lounge and poured a drink. The ice clinked like judgment. On the muted TV, a reporter's voice scrolled beneath his own image. "Former assistant appeals conviction, new digital evidence under review." He froze, glass halfway to his lips. Julia's name, back in the news, back from the dead. He hurled the drink against the wall. Amber liquid slid down like melting gold. Meanwhile, Marcus's disappearance had begun making noise online. Anonymous hosts leaked fragments of data. The internet had started to whisper his secrets into the void, and the void was listening. Adrian paced, muttering to himself, "Contain it, control it." But control was gone. For the first time, his empire of glass reflected not success, but rot. Every mirrored surface showed him what he really was: afraid. He spent the night calling allies, lawyers, judges, editors, men he had once bought with favors and silence. But their voices carried hesitation now. "We'll see what we can do," they said. He recognized that tone. It was the sound of power beginning to shift. Loyalty built on money dissolves fast when fear enters the room. Adrian realized the truth wasn't just a threat. It was contagious. By morning, reporters had gathered outside Vale Enterprises. Questions shouted through the air. "Mr. Vale, is it true you falsified records? Did you frame Julia Evans?" Adrian kept walking, eyes straight ahead, pretending not to hear. But inside, each question was a dagger. The story he'd written was being rewritten, and he was no longer the author. The headlines had turned against their creator. In his office, he stared at the skyline, the city's reflection fracturing in the glass. He remembered the day Julia first arrived, the eagerness in her eyes, the trust that had made her so easy to use. "You shouldn't have trusted me," he whispered to the empty room. His reflection stared back, older, smaller, haunted. For the first time in years, Adrian Vale didn't see a billionaire. He saw a man cornered by his own ghosts. Then came the knock on the door, sharp, firm, relentless. His assistant's voice trembled. "Sir, the court has reopened Julia Evans' case." Adrian froze. The world seemed to tilt. "They found the email, didn't they?" he said softly. The assistant said nothing. Adrian turned to the window, the city spinning in glass and gilt. Somewhere out there, justice was stirring awake, and this time it had his name. The courtroom looked the same, but everything felt different. The last time Julia sat here, she was broken, silenced, defeated. Now she walked in with her head high, wrists free, the faintest tremor of purpose in her steps. Cameras flashed as she took her seat beside her lawyer. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. The same faces that once condemned her now leaned forward, waiting to see if they had been wrong. Across the aisle, Adrian Vale sat rigid, jaw clenched, a mask of composure stretched thin. He wore his usual tailored suit, but the confidence was gone. His eyes darted to the press, then to Julia, then back to the papers before him. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was. A man terrified of being seen. The empire of charm and control had begun to crumble from within. Julia's lawyer rose first. "Your Honor," he began, "new digital evidence has surfaced, proving my client's innocence." The screen behind him flickered to life, displaying the recovered email. Gasps filled the courtroom. The text was unmistakable. Adrian instructing the use of Julia's credentials for hidden transfers. Julia stared at the glowing words, her breath catching. The truth, alive and undeniable after all this time. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Overruled. The silence that followed was electric. Julia's lawyer continued, voice steady. For months, Ms. Evans was vilified, imprisoned, erased. Yet the data, timestamps, routing logs, encryption keys, all prove one thing. She was a scapegoat. The crowd murmured. Adrian's fingers twitched on the table. He couldn't look up. Then came the moment Julia had dreaded and needed. "Ms. Evans," the judge said, "would you like to speak?" The room seemed to shrink around her. She rose slowly, her hands shaking, but her voice was clear. "All I ever did was trust the wrong man," she said softly. "I believed loyalty meant protection, but in his world, loyalty meant silence." Her words landed like thunder. Even Adrian flinched. Her statement wasn't long, but every sentence struck deep. "I lost everything, my job, my name, my dignity, because I refused to stop believing in truth, and now it's finally here." A single tear escaped, not of sorrow, but of release. Around her, reporters scribbled furiously. For once, her story wasn't being told for her. She was telling it herself. The balance of power had shifted. The defense tried to twist the narrative, claiming the email was taken out of context. But Julia's lawyer was ready. "Then explain the metadata," he said sharply, displaying the full log, creation time, sender, encryption key, all traced directly to Adrian's private account. The room erupted in whispers. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Vale," he said, "do you deny authoring this message?" Adrian's silence answered for him. Outside, news outlets streamed the hearing live. Comments flooded in. "Justice for Julia." The Vale lie. The world that once crucified her was now demanding Adrian's accountability. Inside the courtroom, Adrian's lawyers scrambled for damage control, but there was no controlling the truth anymore. The screens, the papers, the evidence, all pointed to one undeniable fact. The wrong person had paid the price. When the judge announced that Julia's conviction was vacated, the room erupted. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and Julia's hands flew to her face as relief crashed over her like a wave. Ruth's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes the truth just takes the long way home." She smiled through tears. After all this time, home didn't mean freedom, it meant justice. As she stepped out of the courtroom into the sunlight, the world felt impossibly bright. Reporters swarmed, microphones reaching, but Julia ignored them all. She looked up at the towering glass of Vale Enterprises, glinting in the distance, the same glass that once imprisoned her reflection. "You built your walls too high, Adrian," she whispered. "Now they're falling." And somewhere inside that tower, Adrian Vale felt the first tremor of collapse. To be continued. The morning news hit like a hammer. Every channel, every feed, every headline screamed his name. Adrian Vale under investigation for fraud and obstruction. The once adored billionaire was now the face of corruption. Outside Vale Enterprises, protesters gathered, waving signs that read, "Justice for Julia," and "Truth never deletes itself." From his penthouse, Adrian watched the crowd with a hollow stare. The empire he'd built on glass and charm was finally cracking. His phone vibrated endlessly, calls from investors, lawyers, and board members. Each one began with apologies, ended with betrayal. "We're forced to ask for your resignation, Mr. Vale," the chairman said over speakerphone, voice cold, rehearsed. "You've become a liability." Adrian didn't argue. He just stared at his reflection in the black screen, realizing the face staring back wasn't power anymore. It was ruin. By noon, the building he once owned had turned on him. Security guards avoided his gaze. Employees whispered as he passed. The same people who once admired him now stepped aside as if he carried disease. The elevator ride to the lobby felt endless. His reflection fractured across mirrored panels, a man split between arrogance and despair. When the doors opened, cameras awaited like vultures. "Mr. Vale, do you admit to falsifying company records? Did you frame your secretary?" Questions flew like arrows, each one sharper than the last. Adrian pushed through the crowd, face stone, heart pounding. The flashes of cameras blinded him, the same kind of flashes that had captured Julia's arrest months ago. Now the lights were his punishment. Every step was a photograph of downfall. At the courthouse steps, his lawyer whispered, "Don't speak, just walk." But silence, once his weapon, now felt like surrender. The reporters shouted louder. He turned his head just once, catching his reflection in a window. Soaked suit, pale face, eyes hollow. For a brief moment he saw Julia there too, her expression calm, resolute. The ghost of his guilt had taken her shape. Inside the courtroom, evidence piled up like stones on a grave. Emails, logs, forged documents, every lie he'd crafted laid bare. The judge's tone was measured, but the meaning was fatal. "Adrian Vale, you are hereby charged with fraud, evidence tampering and perjury." The murmurs swelled. He felt his pulse in his ears, the roar of inevitability drowning out his defense. No more masks, no more control. The board terminated him that same afternoon. Vale Enterprises stock plummeted 46% in a single day. Partners withdrew, erased his name from every project, and sponsors. The company logo, once a symbol of ambition, now flashed across screens as a cautionary tale. In the blink of an eye, the man who thought he owned the world had lost it all. That night, alone in his penthouse, Adrian poured himself another drink, this one not in triumph but in defeat. The city outside glimmered like a stage he no longer belonged to. He replayed old interviews, old speeches about ethics and integrity, and laughed bitterly. "Funny thing about truth," he murmured, staring into the amber glass. "It doesn't stay bought." The silence afterward was unbearable. When federal agents arrived to seize his servers and accounts, he didn't resist. He simply nodded, hands trembling as they cuffed him. Cameras waited outside once more, their flashes slicing through the night. The billionaire who once stood above the law now looked small. Just another man caught in his own web. The same. Red and blue lights that had once painted Julia's shame now washed over him. Justice, poetic and merciless, had come full circle. As the car door shut and the city blurred beyond the tinted window, Adrian closed his eyes. Somewhere out there, Julia was free. And he was finally what he'd made her once be, a prisoner of his own lies. He almost smiled, a bitter echo of acceptance. "You win, Julia," he whispered into the dark. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to honesty. The day Julia walked out of prison, the world smelled different. Cleaner, brighter, alive, the gates opened with a mechanical groan, and sunlight poured over her like a baptism. She stood still for a moment, letting the warmth soak into her skin. After years of grey, even the pale blue sky felt overwhelming. Ruth squeezed her shoulder from behind. "Go on," she said softly. "It's your turn to breathe again." Outside, Marcus waited near the sidewalk, holding 2 coffees and a nervous smile. He looked smaller than she remembered from his photo, his eyes tired but kind. "You don't know me," he said awkwardly, "but I—" Julia interrupted him with a quiet nod. "You sent the email." He froze, then exhaled in relief. "Yeah, guess I did." For a long moment they stood there, 2 survivors, bound by truth. They walked together through the city, the noise of traffic and life echoing around them like a forgotten symphony. Julia noticed details she'd missed before. The smell of bakery bread, the laughter of children, the rustle of trees against buildings. The world hadn't changed, but she had. Every sound felt sharper, every color louder, every moment more fragile. Freedom wasn't loud, it was sacred. They stopped at a park bench, sipping their coffee in silence. "You risked everything," Julia said finally. "Why?" Marcus shrugged. "Because you didn't deserve what he did to you. Someone had to fix it." She looked at him, tears threatening to fall. "You already did." The wind moved gently through the trees, scattering light across her face. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. Across the city, news outlets broadcast Adrian's sentencing. Julia tried not to watch, but every cafe window reflected his downfall, a once invincible man now in handcuffs. The symmetry of it all struck her. "Funny," she whispered. "The same lights that took me away took him too." Marcus nodded. "Truth's poetic like that." For the first time, her laughter came freely, unguarded, real. Later, as she walked alone, people began to recognize her, not as the accused, but as the woman who survived. Some smiled, some whispered her name. A little girl even waved, saying, "You're the lady from TV." Julia smiled back, feeling the weight of her story settle into something lighter. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was walking through it. Her lawyer met her outside the courthouse steps, handing her a thick envelope. "Your record's cleared," he said. "You're officially free." Julia held the papers without opening them. The sound of traffic, of life moving forward, felt louder than any document could. She looked up at the city skyline, the same skyline that once mocked her from behind bars, and whispered, "I'm home." That night, she returned to her small apartment, untouched since her arrest. Dust covered the furniture, but everything was still where she'd left it. A half-finished cup on the counter, a framed photo of her mother. She opened the windows, letting the air rush in. The city outside hummed softly, not as a threat anymore, but as a promise. Every breath felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Marcus stopped by later, leaving a small bouquet on her doorstep. White lilies, simple and pure. No note, just the gesture. Julia smiled, placing them in a glass of water. She didn't need words. She understood. The world had taken everything from her once. Now it was quietly giving back. Justice hadn't just freed her. It had restored her faith. As she stood by the window, night falling gently across the city, Julia thought of Adrian, somewhere in a cell, staring at a different kind of glass. "We both got what we deserved," she murmured. Then she turned off the lights and walked toward her desk, where an old laptop sat, waiting. Its screen flickered to life, and there in her inbox waited one unread message, to be continued. The glow of the laptop screen filled the dim room with a soft, ghostly light. Julia hesitated before moving the cursor. The single unread message pulsed in her inbox like a heartbeat. The sender's name made her chest tighten. Adrian Vale. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The timestamp showed it had been sent the night before his arrest. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. The past wasn't finished yet. The message was short. I never meant for it to go this far. No greeting, no apology, just that single sentence, vague, hollow, cowardly. Julia read it again, then again, searching for something human inside the words. But there was nothing. No admission, no remorse, just the echo of a man still trying to control the narrative. Even in ruin, he couldn't say, "I'm sorry." He could only say, "I didn't mean it." She leaned back, staring at the screen as the city lights flickered outside her window. How many nights had she replayed his betrayal, searching for an explanation? And here it was. 7 meaningless words. They didn't bring closure. They didn't erase pain. But somehow that emptiness was liberating. For the first time, she realized she didn't need his apology. She didn't need anything from him anymore. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. For a moment she considered replying. Neither did I. But then she stopped. Adrian's story had already ended. Hers was still being written. Instead, she selected the message and pressed delete. The sound of the key clicking was soft, final. On the screen, the email vanished into digital silence. Sometimes justice isn't punishment, it's letting go. Julia closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city stretched before her, alive with light and motion. The same skyline that once towered above her now felt smaller, almost fragile. Power had changed hands, not in wealth or status, but in truth. She whispered, "You can hide behind glass, Adrian, but even glass breaks." Her reflection in the window smiled back, unafraid. Below her apartment, life pulsed. Cars passing, laughter echoing from the street, the smell of rain rising from the pavement. Everything ordinary, everything extraordinary. She realized freedom wasn't something given by the courts. It was something she'd reclaimed herself. The world had called her guilty, and she had proven it wrong, not through revenge, but through resilience. She reached for the lilies Marcus had left on her table. Their petals had begun to wilt, curling at the edges, yet even fading they were beautiful, reminders that everything, even pain, has its season. Julia smiled softly. "Nothing stays broken forever," she whispered. Then she placed one of the flowers in her notebook, pressing it between the pages, her final keepsake from a story that had finally found peace. Her phone buzzed. A new message from Marcus. "They published your story. People are listening." Julia's eyes filled with quiet joy. The truth had outlived the lies. She didn't need the world's sympathy. She only needed it to remember, because stories like hers, stories of survival, remind people that justice, though slow, always finds its way back home. Outside, thunder rolled gently across the horizon, followed by the soft patter of rain. Julia opened the window, letting it in, cleansing, cool, alive. The drops touched her face like forgiveness. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the storm wash away the last traces of fear. The truth had set her free, but forgiveness had kept her human. As the rain subsided, she turned to the camera with a calm smile, not as a victim, but as a voice. "If you ever feel like the world buried your truth," she said softly, "remember this, it's not gone, it's just waiting to be found." She looked straight into the lens. "So tell your story. Someone out there needs to hear it."